How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the long-awaited return of Buddy's Book Club. Every year for the past few years, it's been my New Year's resolution to read more than I did the year previously. So 2019 is going to be no different. I did say last year I was going to make videos to hold myself accountable to all of the books that I have read, and unfortunately, I only did one video last year. I got myself in way over my head with that. If you remember, the first book that I read in 2018 was It Came From Ohio, and if you haven't seen the video yet, you can click the link right here to check that out. It was a really good book. It's written by James Renner. I've obviously had him on my podcast before, and we talked about this and some of his other books, which we'll get to in a minute. But after I made this video, I got kind of burnt out for a while. I put so much effort into that. So this time I'm going to do the KISS method. Keep it simple, stupid. So yes, I will be reading a ton of books in 2019 as well, but I feel like I should address all the books that I read in 2018 that I didn't get a chance to make a video about. So here it is. This is my 2018 Buddy's Book Club Roundup.
Yeah, I'm gonna take my horse to the old town road. I'm gonna ride till I can't no more. I'm gonna take my horse to the old town road. I'm gonna ride till I can't no more. I got the horses in the bag, horse stock is attached. Head is matted black, got the bushes black to match. Riding on.
Before we go ahead and get started with this video, if you guys haven't already, please make sure you guys subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell so you know when I come out with new episodes of Buddy's Book Club in 2019. And also, if you give this video a big thumbs up and share it with a few of your friends, it would be greatly appreciated. So without further ado, let's just dive right in. I'm going to roughly go in chronological order in which I read these, but to be honest with you, it's been so long I can't really remember which ones came first. But these are all the books that I read in 2018. Some of these I've read in the past and I'm rereading them again. I never said these had to be new books that I'm reading. It's just stuff that I'm interested in. For a book to qualify for the show, it doesn't have to be some literary classic. It's just any book that I find interesting enough to read. So first and foremost, my favorite video game of all time is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, and the first book that I read in 2018 was the manga adaptation of Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. It roughly follows the same story of the game, but obviously it is expanded upon and there are major differences, and there are a lot of things in the game that are left out of this book. There are no side quests in here, so there's no Romani Ranch aliens, there's none of that. There's no Anju and Kai-Fei stuff, there's no collecting all of these masks, it's just the main story of Majora's Mask. So basically it's the game if you did none of the side quests and just did all of the main objectives, but they were expanded upon. Like, there's characters in this that do not exist in the game, and there's dialogue that don't exist. There's no going through any temples like that. You just show up and there's the boss. So yeah, I do have mixed feelings about it, although I do enjoy it quite a bit. I do prefer the game's way of telling the story significantly better than this, but I do think this is a fun read. It only takes a couple hours or so, maybe less, and I do recommend it, especially if you're a fan of Majora's Mask. But yeah, it's fun, it's interesting. It was a creative choice to actually have Link talk in this. If you know Link, he doesn't talk at all. But yeah, overall, it's a decent read. Next on our list, it's a little bit of a strange choice, but I actually read this book called Stone Fox Bride. Obviously not meant for a male demographic. My fiance got this book and she wanted to read it, but then she never ended up reading it, but I read it. So here are my thoughts on this book. To be honest, a lot of the things in here do not apply to me whatsoever. It's about picking out wedding dresses, all that sort of stuff. But there are some things in this book that can be applied to the groom as well. Like dealing with bridesmaids, just translate that to groomsmen. And a lot of stuff with parents and traveling and all that kind of stuff, it still applies to the groom. So although it is a bit untraditional for a man to read this, I do think that there were a few things that I could get out of this, actually. There are many things in here that I actually do disagree with, but that's just a personal choice. Like, for example, in this, they say that you should send out your save the dates and invitations electronically. I do not agree with that. I don't want my great aunts in their 90s on the internet trying to figure out what to do. So I definitely think paper invitations are definitely the way to go. So yeah, just minor things like that. There's not too much to say about it. Again, it wasn't written for me. But if you are going to be a future bride looking to get ready, I do maybe recommend that you check this out. So moving on. The next thing I read was Chris Jericho's new book, No is a Four-Letter Word, How I Failed Spelling But Succeeded at Life. So this is a self-help book slash wrestling slash music book, but it's mainly a book about life lessons that Chris Jericho has learned throughout his many years in the business. And this book isn't just for wrestling fans, it isn't just for fans of metal. Honestly, I recommend this book to anyone. In fact, he names every chapter in this book who he learned the lesson from. There's the Vince McMahon principle, there's the Yoda principle, there's the Gene Simmons Stevens principle, the David Bowie principle, the Steve Austin principle, the Keith Richards. There's all kinds of stuff in here. So again, even if you aren't fans of all these things, you've probably heard of these, and I think the life lessons can be applied to anyone. So yes, I really enjoyed this book. This isn't the first Chris Jericho book that I've read in my lifetime. I've read most of his books, but I do think this one is definitely the easiest one to get through, and it's the most mainstream, obviously, because this can apply to all walks of life, all kinds of different people. So yes, I also highly recommend No is a 4-letter word by one of my favorite wrestlers, Chris Jericho. So moving on to the next book, we have here True Crime Addict, written by James Renner. As previously mentioned, he is the author of It Came From Ohio, which was the first book that I read this year. And off of that book, I decided I wanted to read some of the other stuff that he's written, and his most famous book that he's known for is True Crime Addict. So that is why I chose this to read. There's kind of two parts to this story. The book is about how James lost himself in the search for Maura Murray. If you don't know who Maura Murray is, we did a whole podcast about it. But basically, she was a student who went missing, and she's been missing for a long time. And this book not only talks about the Maura Murray mystery, but also talks about how James himself went through extreme lengths researching this case. It kind of goes pretty deep into some of his personal life, so there are many facets to the story here. There's a lot of twists and turns in the story as well, so it does keep you guessing quite a bit. And yeah, if you want more information about it, you can check out my podcast, you can check out any of James's podcasts that he's done. He can explain it much better than I can here. But yeah, I really enjoyed the book. So next, we're getting into some of the spooky stuff, because it was getting close to October at this point. So the first book that I read that's sort of in the spooky genre is called The Monster Show, written by David J. Scull. And it's kind of like a horror history book. It goes through several decades of horror, but as I said, it does feel like a history book. It doesn't feel like you're reading a novel. So personally for me, I thought it was a little bit slow and it was a little tough to get through at points. Nothing against the author or anything, but just for me, it didn't pique my interest as much as I would have liked. But overall, I thought it was very informative, but it doesn't keep your attention as much as I would have wanted it to. It goes through a lot of different films over the years, obviously. He focuses a lot on the movie Freaks for some reason. He must really like that movie. I never thought it was that significant of a title. I don't even really consider it a horror movie throughout. It just has a few horror scenes. But he talks about it a lot in this book. But yeah, there isn't way too much to say about this, and I'm just trying to get through these kind of quick. I could go through every single chapter in all of these books, but I'm not going to do that. I might go into further detail on these in a later video. But we've got a lot to get through and not that much time, so we're going to move on to the next book. The next one we've got here is Button Button. This is a short story collection by Richard Matheson. He's the writer of I Am Legend. He's written tons of screenplays for television, movies. He's one of the greatest horror sci-fi authors of our time, so if you haven't heard of Richard Matheson, I don't know what you're doing with your life. But anyway, this is just a collection of his short stories. The main one in here is obviously Button Button, which is what the book's named after. If you haven't read the short story, you might have seen the episode of The Twilight Zone that is based off of it, and they also made it into a movie with Cameron Diaz called The Box. The ending of this is different from both versions that are on the screen, and personally my favorite one is the Twilight Zone adaptation. I think that ending is the best and the most chilling, but this one's ending is interesting as well. And like I said, there are many other short stories in this, so this is a collection I think you should check out and read for yourself, as well as Richard Matheson's other books. Moving on, we've got The Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Frankenstein. This is written by Carol J. Adams, who is known for many books on feminism and veganism, and apparently she likes horror too, so that's awesome. This is another book that I recommend. I obviously love old horror movies, so you're gonna see even more of that coming on. Again, I could go very deep in depth into everything she talks about in this, but we're on a limited time here. But just know that I recommend it, and if you love Frankenstein, this is a must read. Along with the next book that we're going to talk about, which is The Bedside Bathtub Armchair Companion to Dracula, written by Mark Dawidziak. I think this was my third time reading this book. It's basically a Halloween tradition for me now. This goes through the history of Dracula through the years, the creation of the modern vampire story, as well as Frankenstein in this a little bit. But yeah, this is a really good book. It's basically a novel adaptation of the Vampires for Film and Television class that I took at Kent State, and also his vampire talk performances that he gives at local libraries. I have also done a podcast with Mark, you know the drill. And yes, this book I highly recommend. I really just love Mark's writing style. I am a little biased because I'm friends with him, but I find everything he writes very captivating and engaging. And like I said, with The Monster Show, this does not read like a textbook at all. So this one is a quick one to get through, although I do advise that you take your time with it because there is a lot of information there. Same with the Frankenstein book. So yeah, obviously these are part of the same series. Out of the two, I do recommend the Dracula one above the Frankenstein one, obviously. I just love vampires that much more, and Mark is one of my favorite people ever. As you'll probably be able to tell from my next choice of book, which was also a reread for me. This is the second time reading this one. Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. We also talked about this in the podcast. This book, similar to the Chris Jericho book, is sort of a self-help life lesson book without just references to the Twilight Zone, but Mark also puts himself and some of his life experiences into this. Twilight Zone moments in his life, if you will. I do recommend that you watch the show before you read this book, as this book does give away spoilers. But even if you haven't seen the show, the lessons still shine through. You can still learn something from this book even if you haven't seen every episode of the Twilight Zone. It certainly helps, but the book is enjoyable. In fact, when I read this for the first time last year, I read it in sort of an extended way. I would watch the episode and then read the chapter in the book that he was talking about, just to sort of refresh my memory, because I've seen every episode of the Twilight Zone over the years, but there are a lot of episodes, so it's nice to have a little bit of a refresher. And yeah, so another amazing book that I check out. I feel bad that I'm breezing through all of these, so maybe someday I'm going to have to go and talk about all of these individually, but that would be like 12 videos, so that's a bit of a daunting task, so maybe down the line if I have some free time. So going along with the Twilight Zone, I also read As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling, written by his daughter, Anne Serling. This is a really touching and heartfelt tribute to her father. Rod Serling isn't just the guy who was on TV, he's so much more than that. And if any book on this deserves its own video on its own, it's probably this one. There's a lot I could talk about with this one. A lot of people see Rod Serling on TV and see him as sort of a crypt keeper type of a character, this horror host. But when it comes to Rod Serling, the person, it's kind of couldn't be further from the truth. He's really a really sympathetic guy. He's a family man. He loves to spend time with his family going on vacations. It talks about some of the struggles he was going through before the Twilight Zone happened. It talks about patterns, Requiem for a Heavyweight. So it doesn't just focus on the Twilight Zone, it really focuses on the man. But yes, I love this book. It's a very touching and heartfelt work. And really, I learned a lot about Rod Serling that I didn't know before. And this is another one that I do plan to reread. So maybe if I reread this in 2019, I will do a full in-depth analysis of this. And the last book that I read in 2018 was the novelization of Dracula. I had read this a long time ago. I think we were required to read this in like junior high or something. And at the time I thought it was super slow. I couldn't get into it. But I loved the Dracula movies, obviously. But now it is a completely different book like 10 years later. And I love the way this book was written. It's not just a story, it's a collection of journal entries, newspaper articles. So it has a sense of realism that you don't really get with other books. All of them are fake, obviously, but it reads as if these events actually happened. Bram Stoker really does a good job writing in all these characters' different styles. And it really feels like each character is writing their specific entries in this book. It doesn't feel like one author, it feels like a bunch of people coming together, which is what he was going for, obviously. This I could talk about for hours and hours and hours, but I think that is all the time I'm going to take for this week. If you would like for me to talk more about these books in the future, let me know down in the comments which ones of these I should expand upon. If you guys haven't already, please make sure you give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, share this with a friend, and if you have any recommendations of books that I should read in 2019, please send them my way. And that is about it for this time, guys. I will see you later.